Is that
one of my favourite things. There will be still some left, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm sure.
At the end of it. Okay. Next speaker, Daniela Helbig. Daniela Helbig from my department. Going to be speaking about Heidegger. Somebody had to speak on Heidegger at this conference, and there you go.
It fell upon me, yes.
Yeah.
So Dean said to me, somebody's got to speak on Heidegger. So thankfully, he gave in to my plea for me not to speak just about Heidegger, but to sort of couple him with somebody quite wonderful, Georges Perec, which I'm about to do here. There is a reason for that. So, I mean, as we've already seen, Heidegger, the intellectual giant that sits in the tradition there, in this, if you're talking about nothingness, he's everywhere, right? To like all the way going back to, Carnap picking up on the nothing-noths, and then, people stylize this into basically an episode in the history of philosophy, all the way to saying, well, that's the kind of sentence that gives us what is still sometimes called the analytic continental split. So it's hard to leave him out. At the same time, every time, and I've done it many times, struggle to talk about Heidegger because even within, the German philosophical tradition, where it's not difficult to find a whole lot of overtly anti-Semitic thinkers, Heidegger manages to write his anti-Semitism and many other really problematic attitudes into what he calls his history of being in ways that are really challenging and that I think, pose a real question how and in what terms we should engage with him. I'm not trying to answer this question here right now, but one attitude that I've adopted in doing this is trying to at least resist one thing, which is Heidegger's sort of attempt to stylize himself and his work in something extraordinarily singular. So I'm generally sympathetic to approaches that try to place Heidegger in context. I'm looking forward to David's book on Heidegger and Taoism because it's just the latest example I've just learned of trying to do that, of sort of trying to work with what he gives us in terms of something to think with, but refusing to engage with that in the singular terms, and that goes all the way to the language that he adopts, that he's trying to use. So that is in a way the reason why my friend and colleague Inya Straczynski, who teaches at the University of Potsdam, and I have tried to couple those two, because this is part of a long conversation that Inya and I have been having about a whole bunch of things. So when Dean brought up this conference, I thought, okay, this fits right in. So half of this is Inya speaking through me. Here's her image. She's in Potsdam and couldn't be there. So that was a long introduction, but it's Heidegger. And thanks to everyone for actually quite a fabulous conference, I think. And of course, above all, to Dean for making it happen. Okay, let's start with a guy. Here is Heidegger, still quite young, in front of his hut in the Black Forest, the famous hut. So, as I'm sure you know, Heidegger maintains as a sort of matter of urgency that we need to elaborate new possibilities for thought, that we need to open up new horizons to overcome, where he borrowed from Nietzsche, even the Greeks. So we've seen beginnings of this in Dean's talking about the Greek tradition. So whether or not we agree with the sense of judgment, one thing is obvious when you engage with Heidegger. It is not easy to try and do philosophy without drawing on the patterns, the language, all the traditions that this philosophy has left us with, which in Heidegger's case results in a long struggle, as part of which he develops this idiosyncratic language that poses so many of the problems that we're struggling with, including this problem, how far along that idiolect, as people call it, do you want to follow him? So therefore, we have prefaced this with this quote from Nietzsche, who says about his own work in philology. He says we are friends of the lento, and he uses the musical term deliberately. And he says that he's writing deliberately slowly, he's reading slowly, and he says it's not only my habit but even my taste to write nothing but what will drive to despair everyone who is in a hurry. That certainly goes for engaging with Heidegger and what he has to say, so there's nothing I can do about that. Dean wanted Heidegger. So, among the many things that he's written, there's sort of two things that are central to Heidegger's thought and that really speak to the topic that we're talking about here. And the first is this idea that thinking begins with being. So it begins with being rather than any kind of single entity of which we could do things like say in the first place that they are, or of which you could discuss in terms of attributes what they are. And by saying that thinking begins with being, he also makes a point of saying thinking begins with a pure concept of the intellect. So with something that cannot be grasped through image or representation. So he's going for this apotheosis of the philosophical tradition. But by that, he means something quite different than a lot of early modern philosophy in the senses that we've already seen come through. So he does not mean something in terms of the posited infinite. He does not mean something like first causes that leave us with all the paradoxical problems that Dean started discussing and that have come up in a lot of the talks since. So that's not where he wants to go with this. Rather, where he wants to get is to say, to human everyday experience, that being thing with which he wants thinking to begin is, as he says, nothing in the sense that it is experienced as nothing, but as a nothing that is not just the posited abstraction of something that leaves us with a new problem, right? If we have absolutely no relation to it, how can it be active in any way? But that's the being he wants to get at. Something that experientially isn't there, is a sort of nothingness, but that he thinks is very important and does things rather than not do things. And to him, it makes absolutely no sense to think of that weird entity, the beginning of thinking, and that which we experience as nothing, without connection to time. So it always needs to be thought in the way that, according to Heidegger, it is experienced as what is. And there you come back to this experience of a nothingness. It is experienced as an absence. And then you get like a whole lot of Heideggerian vocabulary about how it is something that is withdrawn and that is concealed. And this is where he links this first really important thing. Thinking becomes with being, experienced as something that isn't, as a nothing, with a second super central thing to his thought all over the place, and that's the question of language. So whatever that being thing is, to Heidegger, it relies on human language to be brought out, articulated, in some way drawn out, revealed, he uses. You know, in his later work, he even turns it around and says that being uses language and human language to manifest itself. So these two things are coupled for Heidegger. And this question of language, to him, comes back to we experience whatever that being is in some form of nothingness, because he says, okay, so let's say we're trying to actually get at that being thing. We turn to it, we try to attend to it, and that means turning away from that which is visible, turning away from that which has already been conceived, so statements, ideas, all that kind of stuff. And then he says, well, then what do we get? We see nothing, we hear nothing. If we abstract away from all of those things that are already there, we've got that. And in order to engage with whatever that thing that is, Heidegger makes this shift that he emphasizes over and over and over again, where he says we need to move away from a priority of seeing to a process of hearing. So he says we need to listen to what he calls the silence of being, and that's the only way to listen to this unknown, unseen, that isn't already a pre-given, that ultimately distracts us from that being. And then you get Heidegger. Then you think, what the hell does he mean when he says that we let go of actuality and we enter that free realm in which the poetic, the creative, he uses Greek here, poesis, resides. So there is this kind of silence that speaks to that nothingness, where he wants to establish this correspondence between human language and being experienced as nothingness. But he leaves us wondering how we get there, right? And to think about this, again, we get nowhere unless we take seriously his insistence that being has a temporality that is crucial for this and without which we're not going to get it. So in Heidegger, that temporality from the start and from sort of being and time onwards, from which I've quoted here, throughout the later work, being is connected to a concept of time where an absence, that nothingness where being begins, has no present. So he says he only has a past and a future, and that is something that he thinks we need to get in order to get anywhere with this. So what we've put up here is a quite well-known quote from the task of destructuring the history of ontology in Being and Time, where he says, okay, if you run with the Greek tradition's understanding of time, which he simply calls here a naive way of understanding time. He says, if you think of the temporal structure of beings, so these are those single entities that are around us that he doesn't think we need to be bothered engaging with. These real beings, if we engage with those, he says, they're accordingly interpreted with regard to the present. That is to say, they're conceived as presence, ousia, so that's where the essence comes in. And he says, this Greek interpretation, which you think misleads us, gets us on the whole history of philosophy that doesn't get us to the question of being and the real problems. He says that comes about without understanding what he sees as the fundamental ontological function of time, without insight into the grounds of the possibility of the function of talking about stuff that way. And that structure of time, where he thinks we're just naive to think of some kind of temporal continuity in which we can just then distribute entities, that structure of time, again, speaks to some people more than others, but for Heidegger, it is this sort of suspension of the present moment and what we're supposed to be doing with the present moment between what he calls two kinds of times, almost the twofold nature of times. He says there is a long past origin and there is a wide future, as he puts it here. And what we need to get at, in his words, is an understanding the present moment not as something that just sits as a regular sequence between these two things, but as something that always opens this sort of scissor-like structure of temporality at any moment. It's not my game here trying to defend this, but without granting him that he thinks that, this simplistic understanding of temporality is what stands in the way to engaging with being. We're getting nowhere because that's the central point for him. And then you've got sentences like this, right, where he says that this kind of temporality, where the present moment is an absence that will or will not be filled by you doing stuff, and we get to that, that's the creative act. This kind of temporality, he says, strengthens the gathering, makes us feel at home within the movable, staying at the simple. This is the kind of Heideggerian jargon that, just sounds absurd when you translate it, and to some people's ears sounds equally absurd in, his use of the German language to get there. But what he's seems to be getting at is again the idea that your mode of engagement with that present moment that he thinks is absent is the grounds for any kind of decent thing to do, really. And the way he then describes what you're supposed to be doing in that moment, the temporality of which you're supposed to understand in this new way, he calls that voicing silence, the silence. He plays a lot with this word Stimme, der Stille here. And this is where he returns back to this question of language. So again, he says, when we turn to being, which for him is to say, we turn away from stuff, we turn away from entities that we simply understand as unproblematically existing in time, we turn away from that which has already been articulated, ideas and conceptions, we first see and hear nothing, that's what I said before, and it is in this silence that we voice into human language and expressions. So this is where this creative act comes in for him. And what is at play here is a human capacity for him. So the capacity for thinking, for questioning, lies for him exactly there, in giving words what he calls their body in a language that then speaks to us. So something's supposed to be happening in this moment that articulates for him a truth, something that really speaks to that moment in which what is supposed to be happening happens. And there's a way to think about this. I'm not sure whether he would agree, but one way to think about this whole absence-presence thing with regard to time, you can almost think about it in terms of a person. You could say the presence of a person, when somebody's not here, you could say this has a similar structure of temporality. That person was here, that person will be here, but right now that person is not here. And that absence will do something to your presence without that person now. So you can simply think about it of where we're missing this person, or thinking this person would make this really annoying comment right now. But it is not that that person's absence leaves the moment of absence untouched. So he's trying to get at a very similar thing with being. There is some quality to the being you're supposed to be articulating that will be affected by the absence of being with a capital B. I didn't make this up. Somebody, just to give you an example, who immediately thought he recognizes this move and recognizes this idea of saying there is an articulation of something that is here and that needs to be said in a way that isn't just a way of saying things about other things. Very famously, it was the poet Paul Celan, who had the disappointment of his life when he showed up to actually see Heidegger and realized that the person in whose readings he found such a resonance with so many things that he was trying to do in his poetry disappointed him deeply as a person, and also in the way in which he portrayed his own thinking to Celan. When Celan came there after the Second World War, and having begun to write the poetry that in a way tries to do something similar, you might say, as Heidegger's after here. And the way we've put it here is to say what Celan is trying to do in this poetry is not to speak, and this is crucial, about. So not to make enunciating statements about entities that are, which in Celan's case very clearly are the Shoah, are the murder of the Jews. And so his poetry does not speak about what he would call the homelessness of the Jewish dead. It doesn't speak about that. The point of the poetry is to speak that directly, with a direct object. Speak the homelessness of the Jewish dead. So, as Celan then put it, it would house the ashes of those murdered. It provides a site for their burial in these poems. So this move is crucial. From speaking about to saying whatever that expressive move of language is, it is meant to get at a direct articulation of some kind of truth that almost becomes untrue when you turn it into a statement, an enunciation, but you need to find a voice for it that thereby brings into an articulated way of being, a state of affairs that matters. So another term that Heidegger uses for this attempt to articulate what is experienced initially as nothingness is to say you bring to the fore a matter. So there is the hidden and the revealed, and you bring it to the fore by saying it. And the point about this is that getting yourself in the position to even be able to do it, rather than do, as he would say, more Greek philosophy, add more, enunciative statements, is to say, doing that engagement of listening to being and articulating is transformative. So for Heidegger, this act is constitutive who we are. Doing or not doing that makes a difference. And that is the point. So it's about engaging in this act of enunciation or not. For him, that is the whole capacity of questioning, to be able to do that and to let yourself be transformed through that which speaks to us. Again, it's always a correspondence between being and the language at our disposal, and perhaps to be transformed, that we use or don't use in order to speak something rather than speak about something. So for Heidegger, to be a proper self means to be, he says, to own one's questioning in that respect. One more slide on him, because that's the crucial point about this. That is the move. He's written a lot about nothingness, but this is what it comes down to. Being is experienced as that kind of nothing that it is our task to articulate in this way of speaking that speaks and doesn't speak about, which is a very difficult thing to do. So he talks about this over and over and over again, basically through the rest of his life after he's hit upon the idea that that's the thing. So this is from the infamous Black Notebooks. This is one of his many iterations where yet again he takes this move to try and juxtapose what he thinks we should be doing, what he calls thinking, with what he calls philosophy. So philosophy for Heidegger, and he says it here, the subsequent, the repairing, what he starts calling philosophy and associates with being stuck with the kind of naive idea of temporality and talking about entities within that temporality is to him just not so much despicable but pointless. So by repairing, he means something that you can really think of the sort of the smash repair job. So we've got 2,000 years of history in which people get stuff wrong. So you go to the smash repair shop and repair the philosophy car and fix up some concepts, and then you drive around again and you hit the next thing and you go back to smash repair and your car gets fixed. Ultimately, you don't say many different things in Heidegger's view. So whatever, if you talk about emergence in neuroscience, Heidegger would think you've just been so many smash repairs through a problem that just starts with, whether it's relating form and content or, mind and matter. But so he thinks, okay, this is us being stuck with smash repair. What we should be doing is thinking in the sense of finding a way to articulate that which we experience as nothing and need to find the right words to say with a direct object and not say about. We'll leave him at that. You could go on forever, because what I wanted to do is take wonderful Georges Perec and show you where I think Perec does something, among the many wonderful things that Perec does, something actually, well, I don't know, similar, but quite comparable, and that I think may help us to try and have one more go to say what the hell we might mean by nothingness. So here's Perec and his typewriter. So for Heidegger, this is already not on, right? Because typewriters are the end of the word, and with that, the end of thought. But that's a different, very funny piece of Heidegger. So Georges Perec is a French writer. His parents were Polish Jews who emigrated to France. His dad died defending Paris. His mother died in Auschwitz. So very much of Perec's writings are quite explicitly about absence, and directly the absence of his parents, the absence of European Jewry. So perhaps the most famous example for this is his 1996 La Disparition, The Disappearance, which is a French novel written entirely without the vowel I, which is quite the feat to start with. But that I, in French, if you pronounce this longer, it means eux, them. And he said, this these are my parents' relatives. So, but you get a novel out of it written without and that is part of Perec's larger program. Perec fits in right here because Perec was very proud of never having written one book that was like the other. So it feels like this is very much like our conference talks. And one of the places where Perec practiced his craft was the Oulipo, the Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle, the workshop of potential literature. with a bunch of writers and mathematicians who came up with very interesting constraints for how you could write literature. Won't go into this now, won't go into perhaps his most famous example of this, La vie mode d'emploi, so a user's manual, where he wrote a whole novel with crazy constraints. Don't know if we have time for this. I'm going to focus on a piece of work of his, Espèce d'espace, which has been officially translated as Species of Spaces. This is not incorrect. Espèce, in the zoological botanical sense in French, does mean species. But it's also, it misses half of the connotations, because if in French you say espèce de whatever, you mean a kind of thing, something thingy. Espèce d'espace, you could almost translate as space thingies, sort of spaces. There's fun in Perec, always, and it's there in the title. This is how he starts, unsurprisingly, with Lewis Carroll. So this is from Carroll, the Snark Chase, a poem about the Snark Chase in Carroll.
Hunting of the Snark.
Hunting of the Snark. And it's the map of the ocean. There it is. So, and in Espèce d'espace, Perec, again, relishes in ambiguity. So he's another one who's very happy to play with, contradictions and non-contradictions, ambiguity and non-ambiguity. And he says this book is not so much about the void, so this is right next to this snark thing, but rather about what is around or inside the void, refers you to the figure.
That's very helpful.
Yeah. And he says, after all, in the beginning there isn't a lot, nothing, du rien. The impalpable, practically immaterial extension, the exterior, that which is exterior to us. So he goes on about this. And from the start, these things keep being mixed, right? There is nothingness as a concept that he plays with. There is space and void, which he keeps, and this is important for him, the space thing, and there's writing, always, that connects these things. So in Perec's case, same emphasis, that you've got some form of articulation in which you work in a kind of nothingness and you draw something out of it. And then he goes on to play. So, I added this because again this matters. So from there he moves right on to, this is just the outline of the book. He says, to live is to pass from one space, because it's all about spaces, to another, trying not to bump into things. Okay, fair enough. Or if you prefer, as it obviously immediately follows. And then he gives you this 3-act dramatization of nothing, where you've got nothing to the north, to the south, to the east, and to the west. And in the first act, that's it. In the second act, you've got nothing in all of these places, and in the middle, you've got a tent. And in the third act, you still got a tent in the middle, but you also got this military aide who's waxing a pair of boots, and in fact, he does it with, black lion wax. That's Perec. You think, what the hell? You also think, yeah, this is kind of serious. You get this everywhere, right? You have a historical contextualization that is both playful and right there in your face. This is, I won't go on about this, but that's... So this is how Espèce d'espace is organized. He goes from the page to the bed, to the bedroom, all the way out to space. We won't have time to run through all of them. I just select 3 that speak to nothingness and that establish what I think is this parallel with Heidegger's attempt to not talk about the articulation of nothingness. And that's the first, and that's quite marvelous. So the start of it all, he begins with the page, because again, writing, and he was well versed. He would know much of the literature Nathan talked about. So the beginning was, the word is not news to him, right? But this is not what we see here. So Perec says, okay, great. How do we begin? We have a page. And then he starts writing on this page, puts a word here and puts a word there. And what he writes, so j'écris pour me parcourir, I write to discover myself, he starts. And then he says, I write, colon, I write as a quote. So he just plays with this and he keeps going like this. I write words on a page, and then he arranges them and arranges this some more. And then on the second page on the right there, he arrives at the quote that I pulled out, where he says, before there was nothing, or almost nothing. Afterwards, there isn't a lot, some signs, but enough of them for there to be an above and a below, a beginning and an end, a right and a left, a recto and a verso. So in this very smooth move, he places signs on the page. This almost spans, like in a vector space, and above and below. So he starts by looking at how suddenly space acquires some kind of meaning through that practice of writing in it. And he ends with, recto verso. He just slides into an elaborate practice of book production, right? But that just comes right after, this discussion of space. And he keeps this all very low key. So when he goes on there, he talks about how much you need to write to cover a piece of paper. And again, we're not talking semantics, we're not talking content. He says, how many words do you have to write to fill a page that has the following administrative, norms of how. So this is how he starts. But this for him is the beginning, right? This is how do we get from nothingness anywhere at all? By writing for Perec. But again, he doesn't try to get into articulation of deep things, but he says you've got to do something. And then he keeps going. So I could talk all day about all of those, but again, I just selected the first one and two more, one of them being this. So now he's moved from bed to bedroom to thinking about apartments. So he's got a whole lot of things to say about apartments, but one of the things I've singled out here because he used his apartments to think about useless spaces, which again, for this time for him, is a way to thematize nothingness explicitly. And of course, thanks for the Leunig cartoon, where it can go. Because that's right on cue here, right? He says, okay, he's trying to imagine a room in an apartment that serves no purpose, and he said he failed. Can't imagine it. Can't imagine a space that is servirait à rien, he says. So it wouldn't serves nothing. And then he says, sometimes I manage to think of nothing. And not even in the manner, I don't actually know what he's on here, not even in the manner of l'ami Pierrot at the death of Louis XVI. I thought he maybe means Lully and his Clair de Lune, where you have a Pierrot lunaire, but then he's got his Louis wrong because that was Louis XIV and not XVI. So I've absolutely no idea what he means when he says that he's thinking of nothing, not even in the manner of l'ami Pierrot. He says, suddenly I realized that I'm here, that the métro has just stopped, and that, having left Dugommier some 90 seconds earlier, I'm now really and truly at Doménil. So he's on the Métro 6, so he starts Charles de Gaulle Étoile, and he goes to Nation, and 90 seconds later, he says, oops, here I am. So he says, not even that. And yet, I haven't managed to, like our guy in the cartoon, think nothing. How to think nothing. How to think nothing without automatically putting something around this nothing, evokes all sorts of bagel jokes. Which makes a whole of it into which we will hurry to put something, a practice, a function, a faith, a look, a need, something that's missing, a surplus. That's one fun little experiment that he does. And again, this meanders. He's not trying to systematically develop, an analysis of nothing, but there's all sorts of little plays of this sort where he does this kind of thing. And the one that perhaps gets closest, if you will, to that Heidegger thing of what the hell are we supposed to be doing is when he reaches the level of the street. So he's just gone past the apartment block where he actually outlines the program of this crazy novel that I'm not going to talk about, so never mind. But now he talks about the street. And the way he talks about the street, he says, fine, I'm going to sit here in this cafe and I'm going to have a look at what's going on and keep looking and then describe it. So again, he says, now we need to write. I need to sit here and I need to write what is happening and what's going on around us. And he tries and he sort of gives a few things and talks about this. And then he says, no. We need to proceed more slowly, almost stupidly so. I hadn't intended this resonance with the early Nietzsche, so more slowness here. Forcing oneself to write what isn't of interest, what is the most evident, the most common, the dullest. So he reminds himself to do that, and then he keeps going on, right? And now he's going to talk about cars, how many cars pass, how many pedestrians, what are people wearing, people with baguettes, people with like shopping bags. He's looking at how people are parking their cars and how many things they need to do so that they can lock the car before they can buy a baguette. So this goes on and on for pages. And then he says, to sum up, nothing happens. Then he does this some more, and there's pages of more of this kind of thing. And he says, yeah, continue until the place becomes improbable. And this is what he's doing there and what he's doing through the entire book. He says, we've got to look at what's around here and we have to find a way. Again, this is a practice. It's an enunciative practice that tries to get at something that is in effect nothing for us. Something that is so obvious, call it everydayness, that it is completely opaque to us. I quoted here I call this reading space, because at the very beginning of the book, there is this nice inserted one page where he says what we need to do. The problem is lire l'espace, read the space. That which we call the quotidian is not evident. It's an opacity. It's a kind of blindness. And this is where he goes here. He writes so long until this somehow becomes strange, and he manages to pull out of his street scene something that we experience as nothing, that is not usually open to articulation precisely because we don't pay any attention to it, and it is exactly the thing that he feels we need to be doing. We need to, again, he's not listening, he's looking, he's observing, and for him the enunciation comes necessarily in a form of descriptive writing, but it is a similar move to Heidegger's, where he says there's something that is hidden from us, the way we engage with that reality around us, and the thing we need to do is develop the writing practices to articulate that, and that is actually going to be the decisive thing. This you get throughout the book as he moves from the page on which we do this kind of thing all the way out to space, including a whole lot of things. He does this at every one of these spatial levels, where he says, if you think about this spatial level and you find a way of drawing out that which is actually going on there, what is really happening, you see something through this sort of very ordinary practice that hasn't been open to articulation before, and that is the real deal. So the street thing here is only one example, where he says, when he does this, the organization of the street, the way in which people move, what they're doing, this matters. It doesn't matter what you say when you buy your coffee. What is interesting is that all of these bizarre occurrences occur, and you get at why on earth they occur. This is a banal one. This isn't mass murder. But the point is, how do you draw out that which really happens and find a way, again, to say it and not about it? That's, in a way, what from very, very different angles and with very different levels of humor, I feel we see in both cases here an attempt at directly articulating something experienced as nothing that is in both cases portrayed as that which really matters, in a way the only thing that really matters. So in conclusion, I thought I'm going to try and sum this up by actually referring to the discussion that we've been having about this, right? Simply because this happens when you've got a good conference, the talks start speaking to one another. I think that your image of, plains and hills, in a way, Heidegger would think is actually apt, right? So what are we doing when we're doing what in different ways Heidegger and Perec are both doing here? They both say this engagement with what is experienced as nothing is to be understood as a task, and it is a task of articulation. Whether you do this with as much pomp as you do it in Heidegger, or as much playfulness as you do it in Perec, it amounts to saying it is upon us to articulate something that isn't open to articulation beforehand, and it is something we need to be doing because this is what actually matters. The thing is, for both, what I've tried to sum up here in weird words by saying the plains that we've been talking about, and can we remove the hills? In a way, the idea is these plains aren't temporally stable. So if we go back to the idea we've got hills, and can we think about nothingness as that which the plain is against the hills? And then we got talking a lot about, how do these two mutually generate each other or not? For both Heidegger and Perec, the starting point is, of course, to recognize if we try to do this without respect to time, it's not going to work. There is no point trying to, then you simply trivially detect opposites, and you can talk about whether these are logically required in order to constitute each other. And they're saying the point is, the interesting things that we get to be seeing is that that which matters changes a lot over time. And that nothingness that you might think of as the plane, as that which isn't all the some things that occur against, changes all the time. So that image works as long as you keep in mind that it never remains true. Otherwise you're back in, the naive view of time that he criticized in the start. But he says, yes, this is exactly what we need to be doing. We need to be recognizing planes and articulating, here's a plane. But the articulation, this is a plane, and what is a plane, is completely uninteresting. What matters is to get into the temporal process of seeing that there is a making of planes, and that these planes profoundly determine what we do and how we do it. And we need to keep, if you will, keep up with articulating these things that appear to us as nothingness, but structure in the most profound ways what is actually going on. And again, to repeat this, the point is not the aboutness. When we're done saying, oh, what we have right now is a thing of hills versus plains, that's just a statement of, Heidegger would say, philosophy, right? That's back for the smash repairs. What matters is that we recognize that this is what we need to be doing. So the act of describing is what this is really all about. And this is a way of understanding what you might almost say we should be doing, realizing that we should be engaged in this act of describing something that is actually the real deal. And again, for both Heidegger and Perec, you have to say, this act is understood as transformative in two ways. Transformative of the person doing the describing, because as they both would say in different words, if you fail to do this, you're kind of not really there. You're just bumbling along and doing what everybody else is doing, and you're just doing it because you haven't thought about why this is happening, right? So again, this is a low-key version of what Heidegger is saying, but that's sort of what it amounts to. But the other thing is that it is also transformative of that which is being described. Because once you've got this articulation, and you've got it in an articulation that, as Heidegger would say, people can hear, then it can actually change. So then you get this transformation of, call it reality, in which we're moving about, in which interesting things can occur. This needn't happen, both in Perec and Heidegger. I mean, this is when Heidegger talks about forgetfulness of being, Seinsvergessenheit. He said, this is not happening, beings doing stuff, and we're not listening. Make of that what you will, but there he's saying we can just choose not to engage in this process, but it's a stupid idea. And Perec will leave you the same thing. He says, well, that just gives you all of these weird people who really don't get it. I mean, he says this much more nicely. But again, in both cases, the idea is that you want to get at the nothingness that we can symbolize as the plane if we try and freeze, for the sake of the argument, the process temporally for a moment. But we need to keep in mind that A, it keeps on moving, and B, that nothingness comes with the idea we've got to do something about it. So I'm glad you did, Dean. Thank you.
Thank you, that was fascinating. Daniela, this idea that being has a past and a future but no present, I find utterly mystifying, both what it means and why you would believe it. So can you say anything to make either of those things clearer?
The answer is I'm not sure. It's, I mean, in Heidegger, it comes, it's to do with the idea how temporality structures anything that's around, right? Whether that's being in itself, or whether these are the Daseins that are supposed to be each and every one of us. So the relation between all of these different things for Heidegger is the only thing that actually really makes any kind of difference. So by you choosing to do smash repair philosophy and adding up, I'm not talking about you, adding up sort of enunciative statements, you choose to live in an idea of temporality that is misleading, but you fail to respond to the request that the present moment that is absent poses upon you to do something else. So there is a relationality to this kind of thing that is always to do with how do we relate. He does have a present, he does have a past. The question is how we link them, right? And for him, the assumption is absurd that we can assume that they're already linked. So some kind of what people often refer to as this sort of Newtonian flow of time when they try to caricature Kant. So that kind of thing, that presupposes that we have a grasp on how we get from one point in time, if there is such a thing as we can take away from Paul, to the other. So for starters, Heidegger would say you've already made this presupposition if you buy into this, right? You believe you have an answer for this kind of, unfolding of time. And he thinks this is exactly not how they're linked, because the contents of the past and the present play a role in how they're being linked. Maybe Dean has more to add on this, because he's been working on time for
Not really.
a long time.
I have
Do.
two things about time. I don't know that much about Heidegger or Perec, but I know that it's been a long-standing question about how long is now. I mean, that's something Augustine asked, and it's still not really, from a scientific standpoint, it's not really answered, but even from a philosophical standpoint, how long is now? There's even a famous building in Berlin, there's spray painted this on the side of the wall. I think there's some people who think that there is no length to now. In fact, that's what Augustine says there now doesn't have any duration at all. So there really is no present. Present doesn't exist. It's just past and future.
Do you think that's what Heidegger means?
It means more. So, for that, you've got plenty of contemporary examples of people, arguing for things. He does, to him, the concept of time without some notion of being in various forms is kind of nonsensical. So the link between past and present for him is actively constituted. So to think of it as something that you can imagine outside any such thing just doesn't make any sense. So you need to do something to link these things, and what you choose to do to link them is going to matter.
Yeah, I've never thought of it before, but it links a lot to this participatory realism approach.
Yes.
You're sort of building a story
Yes.
as you go and using the past and future, but then altering them as well, and
Yes.
sort of building the story as you go.
Yes. You have no way of you can change both in the process, obviously.
I actually, is it on this?
It's related. I just want to add one little bit from a contemporary neuroscience perspective. Also, to have any experience of anything requires integration over time. And the idea is that any representational capacity of the brain is built on representations of time. And first is sort of a mini representation of a short period, let's say like the very sound of a letter or so. And then you integrate with that over time into syllables, into words and sentences. And the brain builds the model in this sort of way. But the true present moment is, so in my talk usually when I'm talking about meditation, I say that being in the present moment is annihilation. Because indeed, if you keep on coming down the levels of integration of information over time, you end up with nothing. Because you have being if you're not tracking things over time.
Yeah, I have Paul and then Greg.
Thanks, Daniela. That was great. Terrific. I was wondering how you think about thinking of Perec's, the progress of Perec novel, in relation to the sort of traditional philosophical trope of the sort of ladder out of the present, right? Like Plato and the Symposium. It's via sort of concepts, and we get further and further from our sort of bodily reactions and things like that, and gazing out over the beautiful sea of truth, and et cetera, et cetera. And Jacob's ladder, it's all sort of run together. And I mean, in each of those, I think, astonishingly misleading images of what knowledge and inquiry is about. It's all about sort of leaving behind specific things, specific qualities of the present, in order to find a more general truth or a great truth. Do you think there's some sort of reflection on that very misleading way of thinking?
Yes, I mean, one way to read Espèce d'Espace is that it is a mockery of that hierarchical approach to reality at every level. So he has, exactly as you say, this sort of, this sort of, you can think of it as changing scales, right? And he does this spatial scale change, and in every column chapters that he has in there, he tells you how you can see what you can see here, but not at the other one. How, you know, something's generated to get us from level to. So he keeps hitting the unexpected at you to say, and don't you imagine that from here I get to the next one. And he does this in a very, very interesting way, because like that mockery is even in the structure. Do I have it somewhere? Yeah, here. So.
You have to play because it's.
Oh, sorry.
Separate display.
It went on there. So the level of specificity and abstraction in how he layers these things is very, very interesting. So you could say that they're sort of all not quite concrete and that they're all instances of one such thing, of course, until he gets to Europe, which again is quite specific and speaks to the fact that he will mention the specific Europe post-war context quite deliberately, quite often, as he did with the guy in his waxing the boots. And then he says, but actually I've got nothing to say about Europe. Totally uninteresting concept, you know. And then he mocks the Europeans. He says, now they're going to, you know, the new continent. And he says, oh, and the Indians said, hey, we've been discovered. That's what he says under Europe. Everything else is like 20 pages. So this keeps happening, right? So any suggestion that the sequence in itself is going to be revelatory of anything, he destroys all the time. But at the same time plays with it and manages at every level to bring out how that is just a bad way. And that makes sense, right? Because at all of those levels, it is the same game of saying, okay, fine, now we're here. How do we do this descriptive exercise that gets us to anything? And what that anything is going to be different at all of those levels. Every time it's interesting, but nicely unrelated to all of the others. So you can certainly read this. I hadn't thought of it in this way at all, so thank you. But you can certainly read this as a mockery of a telescope model of knowledge, where you can ultimately call them collapse. You can think about it in terms of reduction, but he says, oh no.
Thank you.
Can I ask, did Perec know Sam Beckett?
Yeah.
They must have done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they were around at the same time. So
Yes.
very
And you could write, yeah.
I agree.
Yeah, I haven't run across Perec before, so thank you for that.
Read him. You must read him.
I'm inclined to agree with what you said about Heidegger and language, but I guess I'd nuance it a bit more, because what he says about language in Sein und Zeit is rather different from what you get in the post-Kierkegaard writings.
Very much so.
And what you get in discussion of language in Sein und Zeit is kind of small talk, but it plays a role in the sort of phenomenological analysis of our grasp of beings. So the role that language plays in Sein und Zeit is very much something which directs our attention to the hills, as it were, and therefore it doesn't get at what really interests Heidegger, which is the plane, being. And what you get in post-Kierkegaard writings and the discussions of language is an analysis of how you can use language in a certain way to get you below the hills, down to the plane. Exactly as you described. So.
Yes, and then worse, right? I mean, much of this is driven by the later work. So I tend to not recapitulate his periodization of his own process. So that's a separate matter. But so much of this is very much driven by the later writings and not by being in time so much. And it keeps going, right? I mean, if you wanted to stretch this to his very latest writing, this is where people get very upset with him for when they call about machinations, right? When people read him as almost saying that language is now this thing that uses people to articulate being, right? So language almost seems to take on this sort of I force you to do something thing, because being needs to articulate itself, and it hijacks, it takes language and takes Dean to make him say stuff, I don't know if you need to read it this way, but again, sometimes so you're absolutely right. There's so much more to say.
Yeah, I mean, I find the anthropomorphization of being in the later writings kind of very strange.
Yes.
But I think the switch between the discussion of language in the early writing and the discussion of language in the later writings, if you sort of couple that with the image of the hills and the plains, you can think of it as starting with analysis of language at its banal level, which just gives you the hills and so hides the plain from you.
Yeah.
And then the language of poetry in the later writing, which kind of plays with language in a different way to take you below the hills to expose the plain.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of looking at it, always with the caveat that without movement, he would think, but that's fine, right? I mean, we
Sure.
can. But yes, I think that's a good way of looking at it, and that's why I found your image useful for this.
You know, on this present moment thing again, it's a very strange understanding he has of present, because it's not physics, it's not cognitive representation, it's something really weird. And you said gathering or something, or clearing.
That's him.
Is that the word? What would the German word be for that? Gathering or clearing. But that's what you mean by present, right? There is a. Is that what you mean by the present moment?
Clearing is Lichtung, so this is problematic because he plays on, I mean, and that's for a reason, because again he wants to work against the visual metaphor. So enlightenment is of course horrible, so anything to do with light is problematic, so he chooses this clearing, so the English translation doesn't render this. So he wants to play with what the presence of light in the forest gives you and what it hides, because again it hides all the interesting wood where you can get lost. He goes on and on and on. Anyway,
it's definitely not instantaneous or anything.
Nothing to do with no. In Stan, you could chase Heidegger like right out of the door with that word, right? It's it's Latin. It can't speak to anything. It's like.
All right, thank you, Daniela. 15-minute break, I think.
Great. Thank you, and to talk.
Thanks so much.
Oh, no, too.
Yeah.
That was very good, Daniela. It was about as good a brief description of Heidegger as I've ever heard.
Bastard, please.
It's like you had a tricky job there.